Welcome in. Thanks so much for joining me. So today I'd like to cover a topic that I've reflected on, I guess since I was a teenager, and of course has been informed more and more as a reflection from my Buddhist studies over the years and Buddhist practice. And this topic, or this reflection, is one of how we work with the concept of home, the emotional experience of home, the physical relationship to home. And, I'll bring in this idea of like the spiritual idea of home, or maybe even the existential idea of home. So I hope this is useful to you. Definitely, I'm going to go a little bit more into content relating to the Buddhist path. So if you're interested in that, I recommend to keep watching. So I've noticed that home is this feeling or idea or longing that I've personally struggled with as far back as I can remember, probably since I was 12 or 13 years old. I don't think I could have named it really at that time. But if I look back into my memories, it was there. Not quite a battle, but some sort of give and take, push and pull with this idea of home. There's other people I've actually talked to about this subject, sort of the existential idea of home and what that means to us as human beings. And, some people do experience what I've experienced, mostly like kind of a longing or a loneliness around that. And others don't. Others experience it as something else. They have a lot of, coziness with their physical space and home, and kind of feel like it's easy to find home anywhere. But either way, I think we all work with this idea of what home means, whether we struggle to find it or whether we find it easily and know how to create that for ourselves. But of course, what's also important here, as I said, I'm going to go into the Buddhist path, is a lot of Buddha Dharma, and we can see it explicitly in the life of the Buddha, is that it focuses on this idea or spiritual practice of leaving home. And of course, we can take that literally in the monastic environment of Buddhist monasticism. They do take it literally. Like when you take Buddhist monastic vows, which I did, I was a monk for 9 years. I'm not anymore, but I was for 9 years. It's part of what you're doing. You're pledging to, change your name, leave your home, more or less become a stranger in a strange land or a stranger in a new land. And I'll get into that a little bit. I think for most of us here, we're not practicing Buddhist monastics, so we have to apply this to our lay life. So I don't want to go too deep into that. But as a metaphor, as a way to engage in our spiritual path of awakening, our spiritual path of getting to know our fundamental nature, this idea of leaving home is really important. And I find it continues to reoccur in my life, both as, what I said earlier, this reflection on aloneness or loneliness, this reflection on, where do I feel home as a human being and all that. And also in my spiritual life of what does it mean to let go of the idea of home? Not saying you need to do that, but something I sort of reflect on and have work with. So let's start with this idea of sort of the metaphor of home as a place we feel ourselves, or we feel comfortable, or we feel at home, right? And we use that saying all the time. But what does it really mean when we're talking about it? So as I was starting to allude to in my experience, this has been a struggle for me. I think I am a perpetual traveler in a certain way because I have this difficulty feeling settled or at home. And I've come to know this as a meditator as also a difficulty being at home in my own body, being at home in my own skin, and of course connected to anxiety and stress that I'm often struggling with. So a large part of my practice has been coming home into the body, finding a place where I can find some grounding and space that can allow, the difficulties of my emotional life, of stresses, anxieties, of just what's coming up in a day, that can allow it to be felt, met with compassion, and that there's a home for that to exist and arise. So for me, the idea of home over time, even though this has been a long-term struggle, it's come down to more this idea of, well, wherever I am, wherever my body is, there's home. And home needs to be a place that welcomes my experience, that welcomes both not only comfortable and pleasurable experiences, but also experiences that are difficult and challenging and uncomfortable. So as a meditator, that's been my general approach to find home in the body. But of course, and Buddhism points this out regularly, our body is not our only home. Eventually, we're going to have to leave this body. And, you don't have to believe this, but from a Buddhist perspective, mind is not necessarily the brain. It's something immaterial that functions in the body and with the brain. And mind moves on from this body. It doesn't end, it moves on, right? And so, in one way, from a Buddhist perspective, we're kind of moving from body to body, from home to home. So, why wouldn't we have this existential crisis from time to time? And that's become a lens for me to look at my experience with more compassion, less judgment towards myself, because I've had judgment in the past of like, hey, it seems like other people can kind of find their physical home, coziness really easily. Why can't I find that? And I've realized that this is, for me at least, this is one of the main principles or benefits of refuge practice. So in Buddhism, we have a practice called refuge, and generally on an outer level, this refers to understanding or getting enough of a taste for the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, to see that these teachings can transform us, that they can benefit us, that they can grow, healthy emotions, thoughts, etc. And so we start to feel appreciation towards those teachings, and then we want to take refuge in those teachings. Basically, we want to find some kind of shelter in those teachings. Along with that, we see the being who brought them into the world was the historical Buddha. So we take refuge in the Buddha. And then there's a community that adopts those teachings and proliferates them and tries to use them themselves to transform. And that we call the Sangha, right? And so this is usually what we call the triple gem in Buddhism, and we take a sort of refuge in these. So like we seek shelter. That's one interpretation. But another I've come across is that when we take refuge in the Dharma, actually it's not so much the shelter taking, it's more the act that we are becoming a refugee, right? So I'll say that again. Instead of the act that we're seeking comfort and taking shelter, instead, what we're doing is we're actually leaving home and becoming a refugee. And this is a big idea, but I really, really have been having fun and a lot of depth has come out of recent contemplations on this. What it means to be a refugee spiritually, what it means to actually want to be a perpetual refugee. I mean, most people would just hear that. Maybe you're listening to this or watching this and thinking, that sounds crazy. I don't want to be a perpetual refugee, right? And of course, we're not talking about being a physical refugee. We're talking about a place to land, a place to, hang our hat and say, okay, now finally I found it. Now, let me give some background here. The reason why in Buddhist philosophy and practice, we might not want to seek that refuge in a sort of permanent, comfortable place, is because of a foundational principle of Buddhism, and we could just say a foundational principle of the world, kind of science, that things are always in change, that things are always in flux. And we call this impermanence in Buddhism, the teaching on impermanence. And so it's because of this, nature of impermanence that the Buddha described seeking a place to hang your hat, seeking a place to call one's permanent home is not only delusional because it's not possible, it will actually cause more suffering. So again, that's not a belief you need to adopt if you're hearing this, but it's just something to reflect on. Is that true for you? Is that a possibility that we do find temporary homes, both physically and spiritually and emotionally, etc. But have they proven to fulfill, this kind of our ultimate craving for peace, right? Because really what we're talking about here is, I think, a craving, a seeking of peace. In my case, I can definitely relate to that because, like I said, ever since I was a teenager, there's this sense of being kind of like not quite in the right place, not quite in the right, feeling or situation. And so I'm always seeking. I'm not recommending that. That's a painful situation to be in. And obviously, I've worked with that and healed that to some extent. But it has led me to this deeper contemplation that I'm describing now, coming from the Buddhist path of, what am I really seeking there? I'm seeking some kind of peace. I'm seeking some kind of contentment, some kind of permanent place to relax, right? And the fact that we want that is not wrong. Actually, from a Buddhist perspective, we would say that is our Buddha nature, or our awakened nature, seeking itself. But if we're not looking in the right place, we may go off into all kinds of sidetracks and alleyways that actually are not going to provide that. So the Buddha described that really clearly in many different teachings on what actually we should be seeking. And, what we eventually are seeking is that there is no seeker and there's no place because there's no one to need a place. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. No one doesn't mean non-existent. No one here just means there's not a being like myself that is on its own and not in relationship with other things. The room around me, the temperature in the room, how I'm affecting the temperature in the room, other beings, etc. Right? So it's talking about connection. It's talking about, essentially this is pointing to, now we're talking about Buddhist non-duality, but it's also pointing to relationship, connection, what we sometimes call interdependence or interconnection. So no one is not a bad thing. No one means that we can actually open up to interconnection. And it's not really like we find a home in interconnection. It's more like we find a way to flow with where the water is moving. And we stop trying to dam up or, build our little nest or sacred place in the middle of a moving stream, right? So when we build our nest, our home, etc., within a moving stream, obviously, of course, that's going to affect the water around it. But at some point, that's going to be eroded. At some point, the water will overtake that, right? Depending on the season and storms and all of that. So the Buddha was pointing out, why even do that in the first place, right? And of course, this doesn't mean we have to physically become homeless. We all need a place for our families to be, and we need a place to live. So we don't have to go that far. It's talking about our attitude, more or less. It's talking about our approach, the way we approach life, the way we work with it, what we seek, how we experience contentment within things. So to go back to my story, this kind of mind, this seeking that I used to experience when I was younger, of always wanting to go to the next thing. It's a habit pattern, but I also saw it as a function of not working with the natural flow of things, always trying to find that little nest. Then the nest comes, the wind blows it away or the water takes it over. And then I would suffer. So I don't have like a big grand answer for you here. This is more a process, and I'm more pointing out, one of the deeper teachings of the Buddha, both impermanence and Buddhist non-duality, that, who is the seeker? What are we seeking and why? And is the seeker this isolated ego structure, or are we connected? And can we just start to live that rather than trying to always find safety and security? As I already said, we need some element of safety and security. That's just respecting the world and respecting relative truth. But how much do we need? And when are we pushing the boundaries of that and trying to go over what's actually needed? And this is a very tough question to answer in the modern world. I don't have an answer. I'm constantly reflecting on it in different ways. But going back to this idea of home, you know, can we internally allow ourselves to be homeless? Not in this sense of, I'm lonely, I'm alone, I don't have things, not in this sense of like what we sometimes call a poverty mentality. More this sense of where we can flow and be fluid, where we don't constantly have to make homes or seek that. We can just allow life to be experienced. And of course, we have to make choices and navigate the waters of life. But how can we become a refugee in that? And how do we, most importantly, if we're really interested in the Buddhist path, how do we stay a refugee? Sometimes we take refuge and then we, it's easy to connect with this idea of being a refugee or at least we reflect on it. But how do we stay one? That's the hard part, because everything around us is saying, something's coming to get you. You better get your little, safety net, your little nest egg and store it. And I'm not saying that's not a good idea. We also need to be intelligent and smart financially, physically, all of that. But what about how we're viewing it internally? That's the most important part. Because here I'm not talking about some spiritual ideal or some kind of spiritual materialist practice of going to the mountains and sort of checking out. That can be a wonderful thing, actually, if it's done with the right intention. But what I'm talking about doesn't require a physical change. Maybe I should have been clear about that earlier on, but I'll say it now. You could be an extremely well-off person and still practice what I'm talking about. You can be a middle-class person, wherever you're at, financially, physically, with a family, without a family. It's all about our attitude and how we approach life and how we approach this practice of impermanence, this practice of what we sometimes call not self or egolessness, working with connection and interconnection rather than subject, object, me and mine in relation to everything. And of course, meditation helps us to do that. Meditation helps us to look at the mind and see what I'm talking about. See that things are always in flux, always changing. Thoughts are always moving, etc. We're always changing. What we refer to as self or me or I, that is not a solid thing. That's changing all the time. So can we take refuge in that? It's like we take refuge in the change, and therefore we become a refugee. So I think that's about it. I've been wanting to talk on this topic of home for a long time, and it's such a evocative one for me. And like I'm constantly getting new insights into it and new experiences as I reflect on it. But as of the recording of this is, some of my thoughts lately. I would really love to hear yours. If some of you share a similar, I don't know whether to call it an existential crisis, but some sort of way of working with home that's been a struggle for you over the years. I would love to hear in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening or watching somewhere else, feel free to reach out to me at scotttusa.com. I just enjoy hearing if this content is resonating, as well as, both your struggles and your triumphs and all of that in life and in your spiritual practice. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a good one.